In this week's roundup video, Extinction Rebellion score a massive own goal by targeting the London Underground, and there are shocking scenes of violence at one station as commuters take their revenge. The police ban the group from the centre of London, and the environment features in the Queen's speech. But does it matter when there's a Brexit election on the way? My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Because I'm travelling on Friday this week's roundup is being recorded on the Thursday, so one or two details may end up with updates that I don't get to cover in this video. But there's still plenty of news to talk about. So first of all, we're going to talk about the single, absolute dumbest thing that Extinction Rebellion has ever done so far. As regular viewers of these videos will know, I have been a critic of Extinction Rebellion. I believe its actions are polarising when we need to be building agreement and consensus. And if you really want to ramp up the bad, put the cause of climate change into complete disrepute, you couldn't do a better job than XR have managed this week. During their first 2-week protest of some months ago, they announced their intention to target the London Underground, the tube network, and they got such massive kickback at that point that they decided to rein it in and to do it only as a token protest. Now, I don't know what happened between then and now, but on Thursday this week they decided to go ahead regardless. Extinction Rebellion protesters climbed onto the roofs of trains at a number of stations on the Jubilee line during rush hour in the morning. During rush hour. So you couldn't go out of your way to more completely disrupt the lives of ordinary people trying to get to work. This was no symbolic action done at the time that would cause the least disruption but get the maximum publicity. This was designed to completely mess people up. And at Canning Town Station, people were furious enough to mess right back. Here are some of the pretty shocking scenes that unfolded there. Fortunately, the protester that you saw there, having received a few lumps, did, I believe, emerge relatively unharmed. And kudos to the woman Commuter who tried to stop people from punching and kicking him, along with the platform attendant who did likewise. Those two, plus anyone else that tried to help who was just out of camera view, those are the only people, frankly, who emerged with credit from this sorry mess. Now, in the wake of that attack, there were masses of posts on social media celebrating the commuters taking matters into their own hands, and almost none supporting Extinction Rebellion. What happened to that idea that they were not going to be targeting disrupting ordinary people during these 2 weeks? They were going to be targeting the 1%, the business commuters who were using London City Airport, or the financiers in the City of London. All of that's forgotten. Now the most enduring image from this 2 weeks of protest will be this: the ordinary working class commuters of Canning Town fighting back against the ongoing disruption from these weird people who could not be more unlike the people who they are disrupting. Lots of people are pointing to the fact that anyone with half a brain cell knows that the tube is supposed to be one of those more eco-friendly modes of transport that we want more people to use. I have said before about leaderless movements failing to follow sensible campaign strategies, but there's nothing about being part of a leaderless movement that says you have to do something so obviously and intuitively stupid and counterproductive as they have done here. One of the things that was put out was that a lot of people in XR had disagreed with the move, but because it's such a decentralized group, ultimately people could decide to do whatever they wanted. And my understanding is that there was electronic polling of members, and around 80%, 80%, disapproved of the action, with support for it in single figures. But hey, it went ahead anyway. So if you think this is a group that's committed to new forms of democracy, as they sometimes say, and doing what citizens' assemblies suggest, even if they don't agree with what comes out, I think this would give us pause to say that we should think again. And it's the perfect illustration why this whole decentralized action is a rubbish setup. Effective campaigning requires discipline. And also it doesn't really wash, because leading XR spokespeople like Rupert Read went onto the media to justify the action. Read told TV News the day before the action was due to take place that if rising sea levels meant that London flooded, then that would put the tube out of action altogether, and therefore that justified the action. And once again, it's the same brilliant line that justifies any damn thing you're going to do. Making life terrible for a lot of people? Well, it'll be a whole lot worse when we have climate change. And it's just, do you have any idea how sanctimonious and frustrating that sounds to the people whose lives you're disrupting? Extinction Rebellion also published a press statement on its own website in support of this action. So I think it's fair that we don't take this as an outlier action done by a handful of people. This is officially endorsed and supported. My fear now is, having seen the graphic video of people fighting back against Extinction Rebellion, that this may feed copycat incidents, and particularly having seen the approbation and welcome that these actions received in a number of quarters, that people will feel they now have license to have a go. There is no justification for violence, obviously. Whatever the provocation, it's not a great look that so many people, including some people who should really know better, celebrated XR activists getting a kicking at Canning Town. This is not who we aspire to be as a country. As I said, the only people who emerged with credit from this were the people who stepped in to try to stop the violence. And of course it stands as a testament to the frustration that a lot of Londoners feel about these tactics. But you can't use that frustration, nor can you use the campaigners' stupidity in this case to justify violence. You just can't. Nevertheless, this stands as the most counterproductive day so far in the history of climate change campaigning, as far as I can see. Frankly, we need a rebellion against Extinction Rebellion. Not the sort that we saw in that video. I mean, we need a new popular movement to campaign against climate change. All of the good people who joined this movement because they wanted to make a positive difference, they should kick out the founders, take over the movement, give it a new set of demands based on actual climate change achievable goals in line with the IPCC reports, and adopt a leadership approach that is better geared to winning support rather than losing it. One that has discipline in how campaigns are undertaken, because allowing a free-for-all has shown how flawed an approach that is. Now, it's probably too late. Extinction Rebellion has now defined what it means to be a climate change protester in the minds of the popular imagination, and it's a negative perception that will now hold back any public action on the issue, probably however differently it's done. Last week I made a passing comment about having noticed a slightly less positive mix for XR in the social media feed, and one of my commenters on this channel picked me up on this, saying, well, that's not a valid measure of success. And in principle I agree, and I heavily qualified that comment when I made it in the video last week. But in the hours after the underground tube debacle, I would say something else. I mean, Extinction Rebellion trended heavily on Twitter. I viewed the gushing fire hose of comment. Massive condemnation. No support whatsoever. The nearest thing to support was, well, I usually support XR, but arguably this was snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Because in the days leading up to this pretty unfortunate misstep, the group had some chance of winning support and sympathy after the police invoked the Public Order Act to ban Extinction Rebellion gatherings in London. After something like 10 days of being based in Trafalgar Square and using it as the launchpad for a series of illegal actions, the Met finally decided that enough was enough and withdrew their permission for the protesters to remain at Trafalgar Square. And personally, I had really mixed feelings about this action by the Met. On the one hand, the campaigners' line about how this was a disgraceful banning of legitimate peaceful protest didn't really hold water, because after all, they'd been allowed to be there for 10 days, and there's no right to set up a permanent encampment on a major landmark, not just in London, but frankly in any city in the world. And when you've specifically and routinely been using it as a platform to launch illegal protests across the city, where you're disrupting things, trying to shut down airports and all of that, you can't really look so wounded and hurt when the police decide that your protest has to come to an end. You know, in some countries, police have been using water cannon and tear gas against these sorts of protests, which I don't support. The police in Britain have been extremely restrained, frankly. However, on the other side, using a law that makes it illegal not just for people to camp at Trafalgar Square, but any gathering of Extinction Rebellion people at all, even if not breaking the law in any other way, that is not a measure that I feel inclined to support or would have recommended for the police to do. Deliberately breaking the law is not the same as free speech. Therefore, I would have focused on arresting those who specifically break the law, not those who simply gather in order to be heard. All of that said, the one thing which should have been plain is that in spite of XR whining on about how dreadful and undemocratic it is, they should actually have been delighted. Because after all, the whole modus operandi for Extinction Rebellion is to get as many people as possible arrested. And if they can show ordinary people, not just for hippies, getting arrested, not for gluing themselves for things, not for disrupting things, not for trying to shut things down, but simply for being there and holding a banner and trying to be heard, that would potentially have won a huge amount of support to their cause. And it's the sort of publicity that would have made XR strategist Roger Hallam very pleased indeed. It's exactly what he wanted to see happen, even as he cools his heels in prison awaiting trial for his earlier Heathrow drones actions. But of course, Extinction Rebellion didn't see it that way. And I kind of understand why, because in spite of all the bravado and focus on arrests, the truth is that the vast majority of people taking part in the Extinction Rebellion actions don't want to be arrested. There's a very sizable minority of people that do, who put themselves forward to be so-called arrestables. But most of them don't. So if the police chose to enforce their ban at scale, suddenly everyone and anyone becomes an arrestable. Now, that can have the unintended consequence, which I think we saw in the very early moments after this had happened, of radicalizing a whole bunch of people who decide to make a stand just because they're so scandalized at the fact that merely being there has now been banned. But I think it also has the consequence of thinning down the numbers to just those who are prepared to be arrested, which of course is always going to be a much smaller number. And that becomes a much more manageable number then, as far as the police are concerned. And of course that may well be why they chose to do exactly this measure. So it's understandable why XR then decided to challenge the order with a judicial review, arguing that the police had overreached their powers. From my understanding of the 1986 Public Order Act, I think it's unlikely that it will be found that they have overreached their powers, but by the time this video is published, we will probably already know the answer to that question. In any case, it might well have been an issue where they would at least have gotten some public support. But after the nonsense targeting the London Underground, that high ground has completely disappeared. The only thing that might save them is the fact that a new Brexit deal was announced on the same day, guaranteeing that the farce would get lower prominence in the news bulletins and papers. But that's pretty slim consolation, frankly. Now, earlier in the week, we saw the environment and climate change feature in the Queen's speech at the opening of the UK Parliament. And I know some people say, well, it only got a mention, it only got, 5 words or whatever it is that they were saying, which is a misunderstanding of the role of the Queen's speech. The Queen's speech isn't there to engage with a whole lot of rhetoric about how important an issue is or isn't. It's there to announce what the headline legislation will be. There is an environment bill. That was what was announced. It's been in preparation for quite some time, mostly through the time when Michael Gove was the Secretary of State for the Environment. It was also announced this week that the Prime Minister would now chair a new Cabinet Committee on Climate Change to drive actions on emissions across government. So there are positive signs. However, it's all for the future. Because, of course, the worst kept secret in the world was that this Queen's speech wasn't so much the announcement of this year's programme of legislation as it was a manifesto for what the government will be seeking to achieve if it wins the inevitable election that is to come at any point soon. This week, Boris Johnson secured a new Brexit deal with the European Union against all of the early predictions. Whether he'll be able to get it through the House of Commons will be another matter, since at the time of recording he doesn't have the support of the DUP, which has been crucial so far, and the House has been more noted for voting against everything than it has been for noting for anything. A general election is likely to follow regardless, although the dynamics of the election will be hugely affected by what happens in the next few days. London is due to see possibly the largest ever rally against Brexit at the weekend, at the time when the Parliament, depending on certain legal shenanigans that certain people are trying to achieve, Parliament should be in an extraordinary sitting to consider the deal. But at the same time, that mob of commuters hauling the transgressors from the top of a train might well be reflective of how Brexit voters will react if Parliament frustrates the 2016 referendum, especially after Boris has succeeded in getting a new deal with the EU. So none of this even remotely feels like a good time in UK politics right at the moment. And then to finish this episode, one last thing that I don't like. Sometimes I finish these episodes with one thing that I like, but there's nothing to like. This week, it's all garbage. Students at Manchester University are campaigning to have a statue of Mahatma Gandhi scrapped because the Indian leader apparently wasn't woke enough for them. The element of a revered leader's past that didn't meet the condemnation in hindsight filter was the fact that when he was an activist as a young man in South Africa, campaigning to relieve the dreadful conditions of Indians in South Africa at the time, he didn't utterly and smartly oppose the anti-black racism that was endemic. Never mind the fact that later on in life he became one of the most inclusively minded leaders of his generation. Never mind the fact that as an Indian fighting against British colonial rule, he shaped the modern world in ways that were much more progressive and civilized than any similar conflict that had ever followed in history before him. None of that matters. And it's as potent a symbol as you will ever find against this currently fashionable theory that you should take modern standards and sensibilities and apply them retrospectively to historical figures and then condemn them when inevitably they fail to meet up. And I mean inevitably. There is no historic figure who lived in those times and in those environments who would survive that sort of scrutiny. None whatsoever. So what do we gain? What do we learn? What do we achieve when we do this? The answer, of course, is nothing. How do we ourselves defend ourselves from the judgment of people in 100 years' time? What things do we take for granted today that from the lens of 100 years hence may be held to be abhorrent and just so morally reprehensible? No statue that's raised to anyone is going to survive that process. You can't. You have no way of knowing how things are going to change along that sort of timescale. The question isn't whether people show the signs of living within the norms of their time, but what do they do within their own context to change things for the better? Gandhi was a huge figure who changed the world in ways that his predecessors would never have imagined possible, at the same time, of course, as being a flawed human being just like everyone else. For students of today who have no track record yet of living up to their own high ideals or making any difference to the world or changing anything for the better, should have some humility in learning from the greatness of people who came before them, even as they notice that things were different then. And of course, we are glad to live today and not then. We're glad to have the moral foundation that we have today rather than the one that came before. And we're glad to live in today when we've conquered so many things, the diseases and the wars and the trials and the tribulations of yesterday, all of those things that they had to deal with then. Anyway, that's all for this week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.